Post World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers. And very soon, both ended up indulging in a Cold War, setting boundaries with respect to their own allies and trying to curtail each other with respect to the influence and power. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we evaluate two incidents: the US involvement in Iran in 1953 and the Soviet involvement in Hungary in 1956. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1908 had exclusive rights to oil exploration and refining in Iran. By 1914, before the onset of World War I, British Parliament approved a 51% stake, which equaled £2.2 million in the company. And through the 1930s, it paid a paltry 16% of its profits to Iran, and most of the work was being done by expat labor. Now, Iran was never happy with respect to this profit share agreement, so it cancelled the contract in 1932. And post a prolonged set of negotiations, it finally got a slightly better deal on the revenue split after the cancellation in 1932. However, the world oil economy underwent a drastic change when Saudi Arabia and the Arabic American Oil Company, or Aramco, negotiated a 50-50 split. And subsequently, in July 1949, the Iranian Parliament Majlis refused to ratify the new supplemental oil agreement, considering it too little too late. In short, they weren't happy with the new agreement and wanted it closely aligned with the Saudi Arabia Aramco agreement. Now, a point to note here is that at this time, Iran was being ruled by the Shah, even though it had a parliament and a prime minister, and the Shah was more allied towards UK and towards the current agreement that existed. So he was against any drastic changes to the revenue split agreement. In March of 1951, the Iranian Parliament Majlis approved a measure to authorize the government to take control over all of the natural resources, including oil, and it also appointed PM Mossadegh as Prime Minister. The Shah agreed, but he did not see eye to eye with PM Mossadegh, mainly because Mossadegh was quite popular, and the Shah was worried that he was a threat to his legitimacy. And as expected, PM Mossadegh nationalizes Iranian oil, and a back and forth starts between Mossadegh and Clement Attlee's government in London, each denouncing the other person's actions. Subsequently, Britain imposes an embargo on Iranian oil exports, and Mossadegh reacts by ordering the expulsion of all British employees of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company by October 1951. Yes, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is the new name of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company that we talked about earlier. And Anglo-Iranian Oil Company will move on to be called BP, or British Petroleum. Yes, the same British Petroleum that was responsible for the Gulf oil disaster in April of 2010. And as a follow-up, Britain also loses in the International Court of Justice in 1952, where it has moved a motion to cancel the nationalization, with the court ruling that it has got no jurisdiction in the dispute. And at this point, Britain starts evaluating the possibility of covertly removing Mossadegh from office. However, during this time, the US president is Harry Truman, and he's not too much interested in this dispute, and he thinks, well, Iran nationalized its oil, so what? Move on. But Britain does not give up, and it gets its opportunity after there's a change of government in the United States, and Dwight Eisenhower becomes president. Now, one thing of note here is that on July 17, 1952, as I'd mentioned, the Shah was more pro-British and pro the existing agreement. He is pressured into deposing Mossadegh, and Mossadegh himself resigns based on the growing friction between him and the Shah. And a guy named Ahmed Ghawam is appointed as prime minister. However, 3 days of intense rioting ensue in Tehran because of this decision, and on July 22, 1952, the Shah is forced to reappoint Mossadegh. So as I mentioned, with Eisenhower in power, the CIA in March of 1953 begins drafting a plan to bring to power a government in Iran that is preferred by the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, there are a lot of arguments and reasons given for Eisenhower okaying this plan later, whereas Harry Truman was against it. And many times folks say, oh, the US also was interested in Iranian oil. That doesn't seem very accurate. The most plausible reason for Eisenhower's approval later for this plan was that Eisenhower was not too happy with Harry Truman's engagement with the Soviet Union. He felt that during Harry Truman's time, the Soviet Union had a free hand in doing whatever it felt like in Eastern Europe. And Eisenhower wanted to put some checks and balances around it. And Iran seemed to be a great opportunity because it was pretty close to the Soviet Union. So it would almost be like operating in Soviet Union's backyard and proving to the Soviet Union that the US too could pull a victory in its neighborhood. So the CIA, which began drafting a plan to topple Mossadegh, concludes in April of 1953 that an overthrow of Mossadegh is possible via a coup in Iran. And in July of 1953, President Eisenhower gives the final blessing to the plan. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, and the person who played the lead role in CIA's effort to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh. And subsequently, Kermit Roosevelt entered Iran on July 19, 1953, with the sole purpose of leading the CIA effort to topple Mohammad Mossadegh. So Kermit Roosevelt had a three-pronged strategy to topple Mossadegh. Number one, buy the press and print articles to defame Mossadegh. Number two, recruit allies on the ground like the clergy and the mullahs to denounce the prime minister. And number three, get the Shah on board and see if he can get the Shah to topple the prime minister. So buying the press works right away, and anti-Mossadegh propaganda starts printing everywhere. The CIA officials are actually writing the articles, and the defamation includes stuff like Mossadegh is an atheist, he's a homosexual, he is against the clergy, and all of a sudden you begin to notice that the Iranian press suddenly is denouncing Mossadegh left, right, and center. And as far as recruiting allies on the ground, the mullahs are paid to deliver sermons denouncing Mossadegh. And to get the Shah on board, Kermit Roosevelt tries to use his sister, Princess Ashraf, who's in France, to convince the Shah to dismiss Mossadegh. And it is said that Princess Ashraf was gifted a fur coat to get her loyalty towards the CIA and convince her brother to dismiss Mossadegh. But the Shah is not on board because he's done this before, and he's been humiliated with Mossadegh coming back into power. So he does not want to risk it one more time. But Kermit Roosevelt doesn't give up, and he starts meeting with the Shah, sometimes even in a taxi, to convince him that Mossadegh needs to be removed. So the Shah reluctantly signs the removal documents, but because he's afraid that there's going to be a repeat of what happened in 1952, he flees Iran and lands in Rome, because he knows if it goes the same way as it did the last time, the Iranians and Mossadegh may come after him. Now, Kermit Roosevelt also had bought some of the key Iranian military officers on his side to lead the coup. So the plan was, you create an atmosphere where there's not much confidence in the leadership of Mossadegh, then you get the Shah to remove him formally from the post of the prime minister, and most likely Mossadegh will refuse to leave, and to ensure that he does, get these military leaders to stage a coup and forcibly remove him from office. And not surprisingly, the person slated to replace Mossadegh was an Iranian army general, Fazlullah Zahidi. Now, Mossadegh got wind of this coup, and he made preparations. So when General Zahidi tries to stage the coup by invading Mossadegh's residence, the army men loyal to Mossadegh jump to his defense and are able to thwart the coup. So on August 15, 1953, the coup ends with Mossadegh still in power, and he notices that the Shah is nowhere to be seen. And the CIA immediately sends a telegram asking all its assets in Iran to suspend operations because they don't want anything to be traced back to them and unnecessarily harm future relations with Mossadegh. But Kermit Roosevelt has a plan B, and this time his advantage is that Mossadegh is no longer alert, because he thinks he has defeated the coup and there's nothing else he needs to worry about with respect to staying in power. So Kermit Roosevelt starts by disseminating a large quantity of photographs to the press of the decree that the Shah had signed dismissing Mossadegh. So essentially the aim is to let everybody know in Iran that the Shah has already dismissed Mossadegh. And subsequently, he hires gangs of Iranians to cause chaos on the streets. So there's one huge gang that is sent, which is supposed to shout pro-Mossadegh slogans. And then he sends a second mob, which is supposed to attack the first mob. And none of these guys realize that they've been paid by the same person. And ultimately, the mobs go to Mossadegh's house, and under the confusion, the military soldiers loyal to Kermit Roosevelt show up with tanks, and they are able to take Mossadegh in custody. So on August 19, 1953, exactly 4 days after the first coup attempt failed, General Zahidi takes command, and a couple of days later, the Shah comes back to Iran and takes on the reins of the government, and thanks Kermit Roosevelt for getting his power and prestige back. And over the next few months, the Shah unleashes a huge reign of suppression against the opposition. Mossadegh's foreign minister is executed, and Mossadegh himself is placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. So the United States, as a superpower, is able to exercise its muscle and influence to install an ally in a sovereign nation. Now, 3 years later, in 1956, a similar situation arises in a country not too far from Iran, slightly west of the Black Sea. I'm talking about Hungary in 1956. And let's see how Soviet Union dealt with this crisis. Now, before World War II, Hungary's government had been anti-Russian and anti-communist. So in 1940, Hungary allied with Hitler. And in 1944, the Red Army pushed the retreating Germans through Hungary, and the Soviet forces continued to occupy Hungary after World War II. So Hungary ended up becoming part of the buffer zone that Stalin always wanted between Soviet Union and Germany. And Hungarians, of course, did not like being part of this Soviet zone at all. The Hungarian leader who had been in control since 1949 was Matthias Rákosi, a hardline communist leader fully under the control of Moscow. And the Hungarians lived under a constant fear of Rákosi's secret police, the AVH, as well as there were thousands of Soviet troops and officials who were stationed in Hungary to ensure that it continued to be a satellite of the Soviet Empire. But after Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new Soviet leader. And in February of 1956, he is supposed to have given a secret speech to the Communist Party in which he condemned Stalin's crimes and human rights abuses. And the Soviet Union did start releasing a lot of people who had been incarcerated in Stalin's forced labor camps, or gulags as they were known. So Khrushchev was introducing a de-Stalinization policy, which encouraged people in the Eastern Bloc to think that greater freedom might be possible. So in June of 1956, Hungarians began to protest against Rákosi's regime, and Moscow actually replaced him with Ernő Gerő. But this guy was no different than the previous guy. So students took to the streets, and on October 23, 1956, they were also joined by the workers and the Hungarian army. And riots began to spread. The Soviets agreed to the formation of a new government under the leadership of a more liberal and a more popular communist leader, Imre Nagy. And on October 28, 1956, the Soviet tanks began to withdraw, and many Hungarians felt confident of American support, and this ended up building pressure for a series of sweeping reforms across Hungary. And the reforms were announced. So over the next couple of days, Imre Nagy started announcing one reform after another, and these included free elections to choose a democratic government, an impartial legal system to ensure free trials, total withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary, and farmers be allowed private ownership of their land instead of it being state-owned. And the most important announcement of all, on November the 1st, 1956, Imre Nagy announced the decision of Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact. So who was Imre Nagy? Philosophically, he was a communist, and he played a key role in the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of German-speaking Hungarians from 1945 to 46 as the Interior Minister of Hungary. Between 1953 and 1955, he became Prime Minister and attempted to relax some of the harshest aspects of Rákosi's regime. But he was subverted and eventually forced out of the government in 1955 by Rákosi's, because Rákosi was the General Secretary, while Imre Nagy was just the Prime Minister. So most likely it was at this time that the Hungarians realized that there was someone open to reform. So that is why when they had the opportunity, they chose to appoint or look upon Imre Nagy as their leader, who could lead them to a more free Hungary. So when on November 1, 1956, Imre Nagy announced Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact, Khrushchev refused to accept that because it would leave a huge gap in USSR's buffer zone with Western Europe. Remember the logic that Stalin had given, that he wanted a buffer zone between Soviet Union and Germany, and countries like Hungary, Yugoslavia, etc. formed that buffer zone. And the Warsaw Pact was an equivalent of NATO for the Eastern Bloc countries. So it was more of a defense agreement between Soviet Union and the satellite states. So leaving the Warsaw Pact would have proved disastrous for Khrushchev from a credibility within the Soviet Union perspective. So how did the Soviet Union respond? On November 4, 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush the national uprising. Fighting broke out in the streets. The Hungarian Prime Minister Imre Nagy announced the invasion to the nation in a radio broadcast, declaring, our troops are fighting, the government is in place, but within hours, he himself sought asylum at the Yugoslav embassy in Budapest. He was captured shortly thereafter and executed 2 years later. Captured shortly thereafter and executed 2 years later in 1958. And János Kádár, a Soviet loyalist, became the new General Secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, essentially the new leader of Hungary. At the end of the uprising, about 2,500 Hungarians had been killed and more than 200,000 had fled as refugees. The West was appalled, and Hungarians themselves were disappointed at the lack of support they got from the United States, especially President Dwight Eisenhower, who had initially shown some support towards the liberation of the country. I think the core reason is that right around that time, the Suez Canal crisis was also brewing. But a bigger reason is that between the two superpowers, they tried not to interfere within the areas of influence of each other. So if this was an issue in an area that was under Soviet influence, the US would refrain from interfering, and same from the Soviet side. So to conclude this segment, we have the example of Iran, where a threat to a superpower is toppled by manipulating the system, and Hungary, where another threat to a different superpower is toppled via military force. Two different examples, two different strategies, but the outcome being the same. Installation of two yes men to the superpowers in two different sovereign nations. That concludes this segment. Moving on to the quiz segment. Question from the last episode: what was the original site for the Panama Canal? The answer is D, Nicaragua. Now on to the question for this episode. What event triggered the start of the Cold War? Was it A, the Berlin blockade of 1948, B, the Potsdam Conference of 1945, C, the defection of Igor Gouzenko, or D, the announcement of the Marshall Plan in 1947? Once again, what event triggered the start of the Cold War? A, the Berlin blockade of 1948, B, the Potsdam Conference of 1945, C, the defection of Igor Gouzenko, or D, the announcement of the Marshall Plan in 1947? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, let's talk about pandemics from history and what we learned or did not learn across the various pandemics that hit the globe. Till then, stay safe and continue exploring the why in history.